No one expected this. Trump issued an ultimatum to Russia. The leader of the United States announced a new deal with NATO. Europe pays, Ukraine receives. Why did the President of the United States suddenly change his rhetoric? Has Trump really gone on the offensive? Will Washington's new strategy become a turning point in the war? And how is Russia reacting to all of this? Watch it out broadcast. This is TSN.ua News. I'm Melania. Subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Now, let's get to the main story. On July 14th, Donald Trump announced an agreement between the US and NATO under which the supply of American weapons to Ukraine will be paid for by European allies. Trump stated his intention to impose very strict tariffs, 100% secondary tariffs, against Russia if a ceasefire agreement in Ukraine is not reached within 50 days. These tariffs will likely apply to Russian oil and could be extended to countries that purchase it, such as China and India, which would mark a significant shift in Western sanctions policy. The US leader criticized Vladimir Putin for bombing civilian targets and continuing the war, noting that Putin talks a good game, but then bombs everyone at night. He also shared that it was actually First Lady Melania Trump who convinced him of the Kremlin leader Putin's inconsistency regarding a peace deal with Ukraine. Trump said that after very pleasant phone conversations with Putin, when he would come home and tell Melania about them, she would react skeptically, pointing out the latest Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities. In particular, there was an instance when Melania told him about an attack on a nursing home. The Times writes that these conversations and Melania's influence may have been one of the factors that led to a change in Trump's policy. Moreover, the media notes that Trump's wife became an ally of Zelensky in the White House. Melania's sympathies toward Ukraine are not surprising, since she grew up in the former Yugoslavia, where there was never any fondness for Russia. The First Lady regularly reminds her husband about the victims of Russian airstrikes on Ukrainian cities. The US leader expressed disappointment with the actions of the Russian dictator and also announced plans to provide Ukraine with billions of dollars worth of weapons, which will be procured by NATO. He specifically mentioned the delivery of Patriot missiles to Ukraine, which Ukrainians desperately need for their defense. Taken together, these steps represent a fundamentally new approach to the conflict, from which Trump has tried to distance himself since taking office in January. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte confirms that an agreement has been reached between the alliance and the US regarding the supply of military equipment to Ukraine. According to him, the Ukrainian army could receive a huge amount of weapons under this agreement. Rutte emphasized that European countries want to be part of this process and that Europe is stepping up in financing Ukraine's defense needs. He agreed with Trump's view that Europeans should pay for weapons for Ukraine. He noted that this is only the first wave of military aid to Kyiv. Rutte also advised Putin to reconsider his approach to negotiations with Ukraine in light of the latest news from Washington. Rutte called Bian's agreement a turning point. He named several countries, including Germany, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, as potential suppliers of new equipment. After that, the president of Ukraine spoke with Trump and Rutte. He reported that he discussed with the US leaders the means and solutions to provide more protection for people from Russian strikes and to strengthen Ukraine's positions. Also, according to the president of Ukraine, they agreed to call each other more often and coordinate their actions. In addition, the leader of Ukraine stated that America, Germany, and Norway are already working on transferring Patriot air defense systems. For his part, Donald Trump expressed his impression with Europe's willingness to take on part of the burden of the war. There is a lot of spirit in Europe for this war. When I first got involved, I really didn't think so, but their level of fighting spirit is impressive, noted the US leader. Meanwhile, there is already a first reaction from Russia. Deputy Chairman of Russia's Security Council Medvedev responded to U.S. President Donald Trump's ultimatum regarding the imposition of tough sanctions against Russia if a peace agreement is not reached within 50 days. Medvedev believes that Trump has issued what he calls a theatrical ultimatum to the Kremlin. The world shuddered, awaiting the consequences. Militant Europe was disappointed. Russia didn't care, he wrote. Well, the Russian propaganda machine is once again in top form, with hysteria and sarcasm broadcast for all to hear. On the state channel controlled by the Kremlin, the rhetoric about Trump changed dramatically. Pro-Kremlin propagandist Olga Skabeva has already called him the second Biden and mockingly noted that Biden has been doing this for the past 3.5 years, but, as we know, hasn't succeeded. It turned out, as always, the West once again failed to understand the depth of the Russian soul. Well, and the Kremlin's mouthpiece Peskov stated that Putin will comment on Trump's statements about possible tough sanctions only if he himself deems it necessary. He added that the decisions made in Washington and NATO are supposedly perceived by Kiev not as a signal for peace, but as a signal to continue the war. According to Peskov, Moscow remains ready for a third round of negotiations with Kiev, but has not yet received any proposals for a meeting. Meanwhile, according to the publication XPO, the United States plans to provide NATO countries with weapons worth about $10 billion, which will later be transferred to Ukraine, including long-range missiles. An informed source from XPO stated that the U.S. will provide its allies in the alliance with weapons worth about $10 billion in the first wave. According to the portal, this refers to weapons such as air defense systems, artillery shells, and long-range missiles that can reach deep into Russian territory. According to the Washington Post, the Donald Trump administration actively discussed the possibility of providing Ukraine with Tomahawk cruise missiles similar to those used against Iranian targets last month. These missiles, if launched from Ukrainian territory, have the potential to reach Moscow and St. Petersburg, and this option had already been considered before. However, for now, according to sources, Tomahawks have been excluded from the current list of supplies for Ukraine. The publication suggests that their deployment may happen later if Trump decides to increase pressure on Russia. Instead, an informed source reported that Trump will allow the use of the 18 long-range ATACMS missiles currently in Ukraine to their full range of 300 kilometers. Although these missiles will not be able to reach Moscow or St. Petersburg, they will allow strikes on military bases, airfields, and depots deep inside Russian territory that were previously out of range. In addition, the military aid package for Ukraine may include additional ATACMS missiles. It is worth noting that Pentagon officials have been insisting for several months on granting Ukraine permission to carry out deeper strikes on Russian territory using ATACMS. Trump's determination to increase pressure on Putin became evident last week during his conversation with President Zelensky. According to a source familiar with the discussions within the administration, Trump made the decision to escalate against Russia for 3 key reasons. Trump believes that Putin is showing him disrespect by expressing willingness for peace talks while at the same time ignoring his calls for a ceasefire. Trump was impressed by the effectiveness of American military power, particularly the use of B-2 bombers and Tomahawk missiles during operations against Iran. The U.S. leader is convinced that Putin will only agree to negotiations under the threat of greater force being used against Russia. The Washington Post notes that the shifting U.S. policy toward Ukraine is largely due to Putin's actions. Despite numerous phone conversations between Trump and the Russian president, there were quite a few. No significant progress was made on ending Russian aggression. As Trump complained, these conversations were always pleasant, but afterwards, missiles would be launched at Kiev or some other city. Gradually, it became clear to Trump that the Russian leader was stringing him along and was not actually interested in ending the war. Putin, it seems, miscalculated badly, much like the Iranian mullahs did when they tried to drag out nuclear negotiations with the United States. Trump shows that he is not afraid to punish countries when he concludes that they are acting in bad faith. Putin, despite 3.5 years of fruitless fighting, still hopes that his armed forces can defeat Ukraine and is willing to risk his relationship with Trump to give his military more time to advance. However, despite the numerical superiority of Russian troops, there are no signs that they have come close to a breakthrough. The front line remains virtually frozen as the massive number of drones on both sides makes large-scale troop advances far too dangerous. Since Ukraine plans to produce 4 million drones this year, its forces should be able to hold back Russia's summer offensive. The biggest risk for Ukraine in recent months has been the potentially dangerous depletion of its air defense munitions, which has allowed massive Russian drone and missile attacks to inflict significant damage on Ukrainian cities. Air bombardments are unlikely to win the war for Russia. Historical experience with airstrikes, dating back to World War II, shows that they generally strengthen rather than undermine the will to resist. But they can result in the deaths of many civilians. However, now Trump's statements that the United States is providing more ammunition for air defense among other weapons should reduce the threat of Russian air attacks. This is a great start from Trump, but if he wants to bring the war to an end, he needs to do more, the publication writes. The most important step, apart from imposing sanctions against Russia much more quickly, would be to provide Ukraine with the frozen Russian funds held in the West. Of course, the idea that Trump would confiscate the frozen Russian funds still seems unlikely. But until July 14th, it also seemed unlikely that Trump would provide Ukraine with any further assistance. Political scientist Vadim Denisenko believes that the reaction of the Ukrainian expert community to Donald Trump's recent statements was prematurely emotional. The new initiative from the American president to provide Ukraine with weapons in exchange for an attempt to force Russia to sit down at the negotiating table sparked a wave of criticism. But, according to Denisenko, not so long ago these same critics were outraged that there were no weapons at all. As for the sanctions and Senator Grant's bill, which many are pinning their hopes on, it is unlikely to be implemented in its current form. Its adoption would require a conflict between the United States and India and China, something Washington is not prepared for. At home, according to the analyst, the Trump administration is betting on a more cautious energy strategy. A gradual increase in oil production by the Persian Gulf is expected, while Russia has already reached its maximum and is unlikely to surpass it. The U.S. is also waiting for Europe to introduce new restrictions on the price of Russian oil in order to strike at Moscow by someone else's hands. Completely pushing Russia out of the oil market, according to Denisenko, is unrealistic. A realistic scenario is to reduce its share by 15 to 20% within 6 to 12 months. And it seems that this is exactly the path Washington plans to take. However, the biggest problem, according to the political scientist, is not the lack of new sanctions, but rather that the White House likely does not have a comprehensive strategic plan of action regarding Russia. The only thing likely to influence Putin are major international negotiations between the United States and China or between China and the EU, which could last for several months. And this, in his opinion, is yet another reason why Trump is not rushing to take action. In Washington, it is also believed that Russia's economic decline will continue even without radical sanctions, thanks to the pressure mechanisms already in place. Denisenko pays particular attention to Lavrov's trip to North Korea. The details of the agreements between Moscow and Pyongyang are still unknown, but they could become a new and unpredictable factor in the escalation. But will such actions by Trump stop the Russian-Ukrainian war? Share your thoughts in the comments below this video. Stay with TSN.ua so you don't miss the main news. And I'll see you in the next episodes.